The humiliation happened on a Wednesday afternoon in August 1893, and half the town of Willow Creek witnessed it from windows and doorways and the relative safety of watching without being seen. The stranger had ridden into town 3 days prior, dusty and trail-worn, leading a horse that had thrown a shoe and needed the blacksmith's services before continuing north toward Montana territory. He'd been polite and quiet, had paid cash for the blacksmith's work and for a room at the boarding house, had caused no trouble and drawn no particular attention beyond the standard curiosity that frontier towns showed to passing strangers. He'd been unremarkable in every way except one. He'd been in the Silver Dollar Saloon on Tuesday evening when Charlie Dalton and his crew had been drinking and looking for entertainment. Charlie Dalton ran cattle on a spread east of Willow Creek, employed a dozen men who were more comfortable with violence than with livestock management, and had a reputation for using both his father's money and his own mean streak to dominate whatever space he occupied. He'd been drinking whiskey and playing cards when the stranger had walked past his table on the way to order coffee, had bumped Charlie's chair in the narrow space between tables, and had made the mistake of not apologizing quickly enough or deferentially enough to satisfy Charlie's alcohol-enhanced sense of status. What followed had been a demonstration of power dynamics that frontier towns understood instinctively. Charlie had stood up, had grabbed the stranger by the collar, had accused him of deliberate disrespect, and demanded an apology that was more than a simple sorry. The stranger had tried to de-escalate, had apologized genuinely, had offered to buy Charlie a drink to make amends. Charlie had decided that wasn't enough, that this moment required teaching a lesson about what happened to drifters who didn't show proper respect to men of consequence in Willow Creek. He dragged the stranger outside into the street, his crew following and the saloon emptying to watch whatever entertainment Charlie was planning. In front of maybe 40 witnesses, Charlie had beaten the stranger methodically and publicly, hitting him until he went down, kicking him while he was down, making it clear this wasn't about the bump or the insufficient apology, but about demonstrating dominance and consequences. The stranger had tried to defend himself initially, but had been outnumbered by Charlie's crew, who'd ensured the fight stayed one-sided. When Charlie finally finished, the stranger had been bloody and bruised and humiliated in front of a town that had watched without intervening. But Charlie hadn't been finished. He'd stood over the stranger bleeding in the street and had delivered the final degradation. He'd spat on him, deliberately, contemptuously. And then he'd looked at the watching crowd and made a declaration that Willow Creek understood as law, even if it had no legal authority. "This drifter is leaving town by morning," he'd said. "If he's still here past sunup, my crew will finish what we started tonight. And if anyone in Willow Creek thinks about helping him or defending him, they can join him in the street." The crowd had dispersed without protest. Nobody had helped the stranger get up. Nobody had offered medical assistance. The town doctor had watched from his window and had done nothing. The deputy marshal, a man named Tom Riley, who theoretically represented territorial law, but practically represented whoever paid his salary, which was the Cattlemen's Association that Charlie's father chaired, had been present and had made no effort to stop the beating or arrest anyone for assault. The stranger had eventually gotten up on his own, had limped back to the boarding house, had gathered his belongings while the owner watched silently, and had ridden out of Willow Creek before dawn on Wednesday, with his injuries untreated and his dignity shattered, and the knowledge that an entire town had watched him get beaten and spat on, and had done absolutely nothing. Willow Creek had moved on from the incident with the efficiency of people who'd seen similar demonstrations before and had learned that protesting Charlie Dalton's behavior was more costly than tolerating it. Some people felt bad about the stranger. Some rationalized that he shouldn't have been in the Silver Dollar in the first place, or should have been more careful around Charlie's table, or should have shown more deference. Most people just accepted that this was how power worked in Willow Creek, and that strangers learned quickly not to cross the Dalton family. For 3 weeks, Willow Creek functioned normally. Cattle were moved, crops were tended, commerce happened. The stranger who'd been beaten and spat on was forgotten, except as an occasional story told in the saloon about what happened to drifters who forgot their place. Then the Dalton gang arrived. They rode into Willow Creek on a Tuesday morning in late August. 7 men, led by Frank Dalton, who was Charlie's older brother and had taken a different path than cattle ranching. Frank had chosen outlawry, had built a crew that specialized in bank robberies across 3 territories, and had stayed away from Willow Creek for years because robbing your hometown while your father was a prominent citizen created complications. But Frank had recently had a falling out with their father over inheritance and perceived favoritism toward Charlie, and he decided that robbing the Willow Creek Bank would settle multiple grievances simultaneously. The robbery itself was quick and professional. Frank and his crew had hit the bank at 10 in the morning, had taken approximately $8,000 from the vault, had shot the bank manager in the leg when he tried to resist, and had ridden out of town firing weapons to discourage pursuit. The whole operation had taken maybe 7 minutes from entry to escape. Deputy Marshal Tom Riley had attempted to organize a posse to pursue the robbers. He'd gathered in the street outside his office and had called for volunteers to ride after Frank Dalton's gang and recover the stolen money. The response had been silence. Nobody in Willow Creek was willing to chase 7 armed outlaws into open country for money that belonged to the bank and would be replaced by insurance. Riley had tried appealing to civic duty and community responsibility. The silence had continued. Finally, someone had said what everyone was thinking. "That's Frank Dalton, Charlie's brother. Nobody's riding against the Dalton family unless they want consequences worse than a bank robbery." Riley had sent a telegram to the territorial marshal's office requesting assistance. The response had been predictable. The nearest federal marshal was 200 miles away and wouldn't arrive for at least a week. The territorial governor's office had offered sympathy and encouragement, but no actual help. Willow Creek was on its own, facing a gang of outlaws who'd promised to return in 3 days to rob the general store and collect whatever valuables individual citizens wanted to contribute rather than get shot. That was when someone had mentioned the stranger. Sarah Mitchell, who owned the boarding house where the stranger had stayed, had been the one to bring it up at the town meeting called to discuss the Dalton situation. "There was a man here 3 weeks ago," she'd said quietly. "Man that Charlie beat and spat on in the street while all of us watched. He left before dawn because Charlie threatened to kill him if he stayed. Nobody here helped him. Nobody stood up for him. But I saw his saddlebags before he left. Saw the way he carried himself after the beating. Saw how he handled his horse and checked his weapons. That wasn't a drifter. That was someone who knew how to handle trouble." The town council president, a man named Robert Hammond, who owned the dry goods store, had dismissed this. "We don't even know who he was. We don't know where he went. And even if we could find him, why would he help a town that let him get beaten and thrown out?" Sarah had been blunt. "I don't know that he would help. I'm saying he might be capable of helping if we asked. which is more than anyone else in this room can say. The debate had continued for an hour. Some people argued that hiring the stranger, if they could even find him, would be admitting weakness and inviting more trouble. Others argued that Frank Dalton was coming back in 3 days with 7 armed men, and Willow Creek had no defense and no law enforcement willing to confront them. Eventually, desperation had won. They'd voted to try to find the stranger, to ask for his help, and to offer whatever payment he demanded if he'd come back and deal with the Dalton gang. The problem was nobody knew where he'd gone. North toward Montana was the only information anyone had. Hammond had sent riders in multiple directions with descriptions of the stranger and instructions to search every town between Willow Creek and the Montana border. 2 days of searching had produced nothing. Frank Dalton was scheduled to return the next morning, and Willow Creek had no defense and no savior appearing. Then the stranger had ridden into town at sunset on the 3rd day, leading his horse down the main street toward the marshal's office where the town council was meeting to discuss evacuation plans. He'd dismounted, had walked into the office, and had looked at the assembled leadership of Willow Creek with an expression that showed he remembered exactly what had happened 3 weeks ago. Robert Hammond had stood up, had tried to find words for a request that felt impossible to make. "You're back," he'd managed. The stranger had nodded. "I heard you were looking for me. Heard Frank Dalton robbed your bank and promised to come back for more. Heard this town needs help dealing with a problem it can't handle alone." His voice had been quiet but carried weight. "I'm here to find out what kind of help you're asking for." Hammond had swallowed pride and admitted reality. "We need someone who can stand up to the Dalton gang. 7 armed men coming tomorrow morning to rob us again and probably hurt people who resist. Our deputy won't fight them. Nobody in town will fight them. We're asking if you would." The stranger had let the silence stretch, had let them feel the full weight of what they were asking. Finally, he'd spoken. "3 weeks ago, Charlie Dalton beat me in your street, spat on me, told me to leave town by morning or his crew would kill me. Half this town watched it happen. Nobody intervened. Nobody helped. Your deputy was there and did nothing. You're all brave enough to ask for help when you're desperate, but you weren't brave enough to stop an assault when it was happening to someone who couldn't fight back." Hammond had tried to defend the town. The stranger had cut him off. "I'm not interested in your justifications. I'm interested in what happens after I deal with Frank Dalton. Because I can handle 7 men. I've handled worse odds, but what I won't do is save this town just so Charlie Dalton can keep running it the way he was running it before his brother showed up. If I help you, it's because Willow Creek becomes a place where men like Charlie don't get to beat strangers in the street while the whole town watches and does nothing." He'd looked at Deputy Marshal Riley specifically. "That means you do your job. Charlie Dalton assaulted me 3 weeks ago in front of witnesses. That's a crime. When this is over, you arrest him. You charge him. You make it clear that having a wealthy father doesn't exempt someone from territorial law." He'd looked at the rest of the council. "And that means this town backs up its law enforcement instead of backing up whoever has the most money and the meanest crew. Those are my terms. You want help with Frank Dalton? You agree that things change after." The council had looked at each other, had done the arithmetic of what the stranger was demanding versus what Frank Dalton was threatening, and had agreed. Hammond had extended his hand. The stranger had shaken it. "Frank Dalton comes tomorrow morning. Hammond had said. "What do you need from us?" The stranger had been specific. "I need you to stay off the street. I need you to keep your families inside. I need you to trust that I'll handle this and not try to help, because you'll just get in the way." He'd looked at Riley. "And I need you to be ready to do your job when this is over. Have arrest warrants ready for Charlie Dalton on assault charges. Have documentation ready for whatever charges apply to Frank Dalton and his crew if any of them survive. Be a deputy marshal instead of a Cattlemen's Association employee." Frank Dalton and his gang had ridden into Willow Creek at 9 the next morning, expecting the same easy intimidation they'd achieved 3 days prior. What they found instead was a stranger standing in the middle of the main street, positioned where he had clear sight lines and they had limited cover, waiting with the calm of someone who'd done this before. Frank had recognized the setup immediately, had understood he was facing someone competent, and had tried to de-escalate. "You're not from Willow Creek," he'd called out. "This isn't your fight. Ride away and nobody needs to die today." The stranger had responded with clarity. "You robbed this town. You shot a bank manager. You threatened to come back and hurt more people. That makes it my fight if I say it is. You can turn around and ride out now and I'll let you go. Or you can try to finish what you came to do and find out what happens." Frank had made the calculation that most outlaws made when facing someone who wasn't afraid. He'd decided the stranger was probably good, but probably not good enough to handle 7 men. And he'd given the signal for his crew to spread out and prepare for a fight they thought they'd win through numbers. The gunfight had lasted less than a minute. The stranger had moved first, had dropped 2 of Frank's crew before they'd finished positioning, had used the chaos and smoke to control angles and eliminate threats with the efficiency of someone who understood combat geometry. Frank had been the 4th to fall, shot through the shoulder and disarmed before he could return effective fire. By the time the smoke cleared, 3 of Frank's crew were dead, 2 were wounded badly enough to be out of the fight, and Frank and 1 other were wounded and surrendering. Willow Creek had watched from windows again, had witnessed competence and violence that made Charlie's beating of an unarmed man 3 weeks ago look like playground bullying. When it was over, when the stranger had disarmed the survivors and secured them for the deputy marshal to arrest, the town had emerged slowly and quietly. No cheering this time, just recognition that they'd been saved by someone they'd thrown out. Deputy Marshal Riley had arrested Frank Dalton and his surviving crew on charges of bank robbery, assault, and attempted murder. Then, with the stranger watching, Riley had walked to the Dalton ranch and had arrested Charlie Dalton on charges of assault and battery for the beating that had happened 3 weeks ago in front of 40 witnesses. Charlie's father had protested. Riley had done his job anyway, understanding that the stranger had made things change and there was no going back to how they were before. The stranger had left Willow Creek the next day, declining the town's offers of payment and gratitude, accepting only supplies for the road and the satisfaction of knowing that things would be different after he left. Robert Hammond had tried to apologize for the beating, for the town's failure to intervene. The stranger had been honest. "You didn't fail to intervene because you were cowardly. You failed because you'd learned that intervening against Charlie Dalton had consequences and staying silent was easier. I don't need your apologies. I need you to remember that the same logic that kept you silent when Charlie was beating me would have kept you silent when Frank was robbing you if you'd thought you could get away with it. Don't thank me for saving you. Thank me for showing you what you were. Here's what's worth understanding about frontier towns and the violence they tolerated until it threatened them directly. The most dangerous thing wasn't the outlaws who came to rob banks. It was the culture that allowed men like Charlie Dalton to beat strangers in the street while everyone watched, that prioritized avoiding conflict with powerful families over enforcing basic standards of decent behavior. Willow Creek had spat on a stranger because he'd bumped a table and hadn't been deferential enough. Then they'd begged that same stranger to save them when his absence left them defenseless against worse violence. 20 towns now, and in one of them, people were learning that the man you throw out when he's weak might be the man you need when you're weaker. That tolerating bullies because they're local means you have no allies when worse bullies arrive. That the culture you build determines whether you can survive crises or whether you have to beg strangers for mercy you didn't show when you had the chance. Tell me something before you go. Where in the world are you hearing this story right now? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this trail reaches. And if you want to keep riding, if you want to know what happens when the town that spat on the stranger has to beg him to return, and he makes them change to earn his help, the story is waiting for you on the screen right now. Watch it. The road north toward Montana was finally clear of interruptions, and somewhere behind him, Willow Creek was adjusting to life where Charlie Dalton didn't run the street, and Deputy Marshal Riley did his actual job, and people were learning that the culture they'd tolerated had nearly destroyed them. The stranger rode on, carrying the satisfaction of a town forced to confront what it had become, and a beating avenged not through revenge, but through requiring change as the price of salvation. I'll see you on the trail.